Hey guys, tonight we are slipping quietly through a monastery gate, the wood worn smooth by centuries of hands, the iron hinges creaking like an old man's knees. The sun has only just sunk beyond the hills, and the courtyard is bathed in twilight. You can almost smell damp stone, beeswax candles, and the faint whiff of sheep that were herded past earlier in the day. Inside the cloister walls, the monks are settling into their rhythm of prayers and work, their sandaled feet whispering across flagstones. Now, you probably won't survive this. Living the life of a medieval monk wasn't exactly a spa retreat. Your day would start before sunrise with chants in an unheated chapel. Meals would be as plain as boiled peas, and talking was limited by rules you'd almost certainly forget to follow. But it's in this quiet, relentless world that the mystery of animal bones and writing ink begins. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching right now, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The monastery at nightfall is both peaceful and strange. You trail behind a monk carrying a lantern, its flame wobbling in the breeze. The walls are thick, meant to keep out raiders, but they also lock in the smells: stewed cabbage, candle smoke, and a hint of charred something coming from a side workshop. That charred something, as you'll later discover, might well be a pile of animal bones roasting down to carbon, destined for the ink that will preserve prayers, laws, and sometimes cheeky doodles in the margins. You watch as the community finishes Compline, their final prayer of the day. The voices echo in Latin, low and steady, like the rumble of bees in a hive. The flicker of torches against the frescoes makes shadows of saints waver like they're breathing. After the last Amen, the monks bow and disperse into the cloister walk, their habits brushing against the stone. Silence descends. One monk nods at you, a quiet invitation. You follow him down a side passage. The lantern light reveals racks of drying herbs, jars of powders, and bundles of quills. There are no labels. Recipes here are learned by memory, whispered from one brother to another. The smell intensifies, a blend of vinegar, smoke, and the unmistakable tang of burnt marrow. It feels like a secret corner of the monastery, away from the grand altar and solemn chanting. Here, the practical alchemy of making ink unfolds. And remember, at this point in history, books are so rare that a library of 30 volumes is a serious brag. One wrong ink recipe and an entire gospel manuscript could fade into nothing within decades. You glance at a shelf, little clay pots sealed with wax, each filled with some ingredient. Charcoal from oak galls, soot scraped from lampblack, ground minerals, and, tucked at the back, a bundle of slender bones, bleached pale. You realize with a start that they are leftovers from dinner, carefully cleaned. To your modern mind, this is recycling at its most creative, but to the monks, it is normal, even holy, nothing wasted. A mainstream fact here: many monastic scriptoria across Europe used bone-black pigment made by burning animal bones at high heat, producing a fine carbon powder. That powder, mixed beautifully with binders like gum arabic,
creating an ink that clung to parchment for centuries. A quirky tidbit. Sometimes the monks didn't just use cow or sheep bones. They experimented with fish bones or even eggshells, though the results were notoriously streaky. And a scholarly debate still lingers. Did monks develop this bone-black recipe themselves, or did they adapt knowledge from older Roman and Arabic traditions of pigment making? The answer drifts in the shadows, uncertain. As the lantern light swings across the workshop, you notice a half-written page resting on a desk. A quill lies beside it, the nib dark with fresh ink. The words, lines of psalms, are so carefully formed that each one looks like it took a breath to shape. And you imagine the quiet drama of this process, a living cow grazing in a field, its hide someday scraped into parchment, its bones burned into pigment, its existence literally embedded in scripture. In a monastery's economy, an animal was not just food, but a partner in the divine act of writing. You lean closer to the hearth. A monk stirs the embers, and the faint sound of brittle bone cracking under heat drifts upward. It's strangely soothing, like a campfire, though the scent is more pungent. You picture a future scholar, hundreds of years later, peering at this very ink under a microscope and finding tiny traces of calcium and carbon, proof that bones had once lived, breathed, and now linger in every word. The night deepens. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots, muffled by thick walls. You realize that the monastery is alive not only with prayers, but with the quiet industry of crafts like this. Bone turned to ink, ink turned to scripture, scripture turned to timeless legacy. The monks may not laugh much, but if they did, they might smirk at the idea that the cow who once mooed in the pasture is now whispering the Gospel of John on a vellum page. And so, as the cloister sleeps, you find yourself steeped in the glow of candlelight, listening to bones crumble, ink pots clink, and quills scratch. The mystery of why monks collected animal bones is no longer strange. It is inevitable, practical, and, in a quiet way, beautiful.
You wake to a bell that isn't so much rung as persuaded into consciousness. A soft bronze yawn rippling through the dormitory. It's the middle of the night, matins, when the stars still look awake and you decidedly do not. You swing your legs from the wooden cot, feel the rush of cold stone through your soles, and shuffle along with the others toward the church. The breath of the community rises as one mist in the chill. You're not scrolling anything. Your feed is chant, and the algorithm is the rule of Saint Benedict. You stand in the choir stalls, the candles painting a honeyed edge along the carved wood, and you sing in that flat, steady way that smooths your heartbeat. A mainstream historical fact slips in as naturally as the next psalm. The Benedictine rule, written in the 6th century, structures this day. Ora et labora, prayer and work, dividing it by the canonical hours like pearls on a string. Matins, also called vigils, lauds near dawn, prime in the early morning before later reforms, then terce, sext, none, vespers, and at last compline again. The schedule is the monastery's spine. You just flex around it. After lauds, dawn unzips the sky, and you file into the warming room where a brazier clicks softly. Breakfast is minimalist, a heel of bread, maybe a little cheese if the cow was generous, and watered ale. Call it medieval cold brew if it helps. On fast days, and there are many, sprinkled across Advent, Lent, and weekly rhythms, you're mostly dining on piety and legumes. You push a wooden spoon through a bowl of pottage, thick with leeks and barley, while a reader stands on a small pulpit and reads aloud. The refectory's hush is protected by custom. Mouths eat, ears listen. You don't ask to pass the salt, you signal with your hands, because many orders keep a system of monastic sign language to maintain silence. Here's your quirky tidbit. Cistercian houses compiled surprisingly rich sign lists, with gestures for book, ink, eel, and even honey, which tells you everything about priorities, piety, paperwork, and snacks. You finish, and a brother clacks the wooden tablet, the table bell, releasing everyone back into the stream of the day. You taste a lingering sweetness of honey, and remember, faintly, the sharper tang from last night's workshop: smoke, vinegar, char. Already, the rhythm is making room for that other chapter of the day, the part where bones become useful again. Prime, and yes, in this medieval world, prime is still very much on the calendar, drops you into the practical side of life. You trudge past raised beds bulging with wintered cabbages, past the fish ponds rippling under a light skin of mist, past the guest house where a weary traveler is being handed a bowl of something warm, because hospitality is not optional here. You might be assigned to the garden, tugging weeds with a meditative patience that would put modern mindfulness apps out of business. Or you're in the bakehouse, learning that ovens radiate a sleepy sort of thunder. Or, lucky you, you're headed toward the scriptorium and the workshop nearby, where little clay pots and bundles of quills live. You parse out the morning by bells. Terce, mid-morning, a breath of prayer that rinses the mind. Sext at noon, when the sun climbs and even the stone walls seem to sigh. Between these punctuations, you work. If your task is in the kitchen today, you notice how bones collect themselves almost naturally. Lunch, again, modest, leaves chicken bones, mutton bones, a scatter of fish spines. Nothing goes to waste. The cook saves the broth, the cellarer saves the fat, and a brother with ink-stained fingers, who now and then smells faintly of vinegar, saves the clean, pale length for later. No one shouts, "Don't throw that away, it's for art," but that's the idea. Here's joke number one. Your monastery doesn't do meal prep so much as centuries-long archival prep. Every scrap is a footnote in a recipe, and nothing gets composted without an argument from a practical brother who's thinking about pigment. Remember that little whisper from last night, the cow in the gospel? The kitchen is where that whisper begins, with a stack of rinsed bones drying near the hearth, politely waiting to become language. Work drifts. You're sent to the scriptorium to mend quill tips. You sit on a long bench, your knees grateful and your fingers waking up to the feel of the feather's spine, the cut down toward the nib, the careful slice at just the right angle. The room smells like vellum, an oddly warm, animal vanilla smell, and the occasional flare of lamp oil. A cat pads by, utterly certain it owns the place, checking on mouse patrols with the bored professionalism of a supervisor. Another quirky note, some monasteries not only tolerated the cats, but they wrote little notes about them in margins, praising their mouse catching while a tired monk tried to keep ink from spattering the parchment. Yes, you want to pet the cat. No, you don't. The cat has a union. By noon, mid-afternoon, the day's shape is clear enough to rest your mind inside it. You copy a line, practice letters on scrap parchment, feel the slight drag of the quill, the tiny burr that catches if you cut too shallow. The ink today is thick, a good sign. Yesterday, some of it turned watery in the pot, and the illuminator's blue sulked along the lines. Historians still argue whether every monastery kept a dedicated scriptorium producing book after book, or whether many houses mostly bought or traded for what they needed, copying just enough to justify the training. The evidence is patchy,
like sunlight through a cloistered arch. But this place, tonight, has pages in progress and ink to use, and that means someone has to feed the workshop with pigment. The bell calls you to vespers. You fold yourself back into chant, hands sliding lightly along the wood. Your mind notices the strange coordination of this place. Prayer shakes the dust, and then hands turn back to work. Work lifts the hands, and then voices turn to prayer. The same bones that thickened a stew now get their second life in a pot, and later a third life as words, mercy, light, amen, skating forever across a page. Joke number 2 arrives gently. You realize your calendar app in here is a sundial with notifications by bell, and there's no snooze button except humility. Evening brings the refectory's glow. The reader's voice has that rill of water quality you could sleep to. You take a bite of something soft, peas perhaps, or a slice of cold fish, and a draught of small beer. A mainstream fact folds in with the steam. Monastic diets vary by region and order, but many houses brew their own ale, a safer drink than raw water, and a source of calories for long fasts. Some even keep careful tallies of daily allowances. You wonder if your modern fitness tracker would just give up here and go take vows. After the meal, the practical magic begins again. Bones are gathered into a clean basket, a little procession that looks nothing like relics, but feels a bit like devotion anyway. You follow as they go not to the midden, but to a side room, the workshop you've already begun to know by scent. No one narrates, they don't need to. The rhythm has created a space after supper, before compline, when tasks that don't belong in the rush of daytime can happen without hurry. There's time for experiments, for the kind of slow craft that rewards patience and remembers failures. Historians still argue whether the silence kept during work was as strict as the rule suggests, or if daily reality softened it with practical murmurs. That pot is too hot. Pass the gum. The cat knocked over the ink again. Whispered under breath when nobody official was looking. Your own ears catch only the soft clank of ceramic and the sigh of the brazier. You get the sense that secrets live here, not scandalous ones, but recipes, proportions, a certain feel for when bone is ready for the next step. Knowledge is muscle memory as much as it is instruction. Compline comes. You return to the church, and the room wraps around you like a cloak. The final prayers of the day nestle into your chest, and you breathe easier. Joke number 3 sidles by in the dark. If modern you tried to keep this schedule unaided, you'd be the only person to fall asleep during the bell. Fortunately, the monastery keeps you upright, like a friend with firm boundaries and an early bedtime. You drift back toward your cot after the final Amen, but your mind hangs a moment at the workshop door. The bones in the basket gleam like slim moons. Tomorrow or the next night, they'll move toward the fire. For now they rest, and you rest, and the timetable has done what it was designed to do. Make space for prayer, labor, study, charity, and the odd crafts that make language material. In a world where texts can evaporate with a dead battery, this feels reassuringly solid: bells, bread, and a calendar that turns scraps into scripture. You pull the blanket over your shoulders, and the last thing you smell is that faint thread of smoke, like an ellipsis at the end of the day, telling you the sentence isn't over yet. It's just pausing for breath. Morning comes in a wash of pewter light
and you find yourself carrying a single sheet of parchment like it's a sleeping bird you don't want to wake. The librarian, more keys than a janitor, fewer smiles than a saint in stone, unlocks the armarium, the book cupboard. You slide the sheet onto a lectern where a thick volume waits under a chain. Yes, a chain. Books here wear jewelry, not for fashion, but for security. A chained book is a reminder that knowledge is portable wealth that must be gently anchored to the room. You run a finger just above the page, not touching, feeling the air tense with the fact that one smudge, one bad ink batch, might turn months of work into an elegant disaster. You already know the monastery's schedule is more reliable than the weather, but the economy of the place is quieter still. Everything funnels toward text. Without good ink, the chants you sang evaporate into stone, and the rules that govern your sleep and soup fade to rumor. Ink is the battery that keeps memory charged. Finite, yes, but if mixed well, surprisingly long-lived. That's why when the cellarer counts the kegs and the almoner counts the loaves, someone else is counting gum Arabic lumps and oak galls as if they were coins. A mainstream fact floats in like the note after a bell. A full-sized medieval Bible could take years to complete, and depending on size and script, hundreds of animal skins to produce. The parchment alone is an investment you could trade for land or favor. Gold leaf dazzles on the margins, sure, but it's the black text that does the heavy lifting. The calendar of feasts, the psalms you chant by heart, the legal formulae that bind donors to promises. If gold is the halo, ink is the heartbeat, steady and dark. You watch the librarian test yesterday's ink on a scrap, just a line, slow and thoughtful. It dries to a solemn black. Good. Bad ink sulks to brown or runs like gossip. Iron gall ink, made from crushed oak galls, water and vitriol, has been the continent's workhorse since late antiquity, and you feel its seriousness. It bites into parchment just enough to cling. Carbon inks, lamp black from soot or bone black from last night's char, sit more on the surface, velvety and deep. Each has its purpose. For text, iron gall's chemistry grips the fibers. For drawings and washes, carbon's lushness sings. When the two are well made, they age like a grand monastery cheese. Complex, reliable, occasionally whiffy if you stick your nose too close. Here's your first joke of the day. Illuminators like to think they're the influencers, sprinkling gold like confetti. Scribes smile into their sleeves, because the party doesn't start until the letters show up. Gold gets the likes. Your dark lines get the watch time. You head to the workshop and pass a window where the lay brother assigned to accounts is tallying rents. He's holding a split hazel stick with notches, the medieval receipt that says, "You paid, I promise I remembered." Tally sticks are another way to fix memory, and England will love them so much they'll use them for centuries. But when law needs precision, or a bishop's charter requires the air of eternity, you need words and seals, ink to speak before a judge long after the voices have fallen quiet. That's why the monks baby their ink pots like they're baby birds. At the bench, you stir a pot where yesterday's iron gall brew has settled. Oak galls, those odd, knobbly growths on oak leaves, made when tiny wasps persuade the tree to build a fortress for their larvae, are loaded with tannins. Soak and crush them, add green vitriol, and watch magic happen as a pale liquid oxidizes to gray, then black upon exposure to air. A quirky tidbit. Some recipes ask for wine or vinegar to steep the galls, a few call for a dash of urine, and you decide that's one vintage you'll skip at dinner. Still, monks are practical, and if it fixes the text, it's on the table. Metaphorically, please.
You think of supply lines the way a monk does, not like a merchant. Gum Arabic doesn't grow on these chilly hills. It clings to acacia in warmer lands. Somebody, caravans, ships, middlemen with excellent memories, moves it north and west so your letters won't flake. Lamp oil, vitriol, pumice for erasing, fine sand for drying, each is a link in a quiet chain that binds your little workshop to deserts and ports, abbeys and fairs. Historians still argue whether the boom in book production that sweeps the 12th and 13th centuries owes more to monastic scriptoria or to the rise of urban stationers feeding universities. But either way, the river of ink widens, and the sources that feed it become lifelines. You check a shelf of parchments, some new, some suspiciously thin. Palimpsests live here, pages scraped and burnished to reuse because fresh skins cost more than patience. If the prior says a text must go, it goes. You scrape, wash, smooth, and write again. Under ankled light, ghost letters sometimes bloom through, pale as old scars. Iron gall ink can bite deeply enough that its memory resists the knife. It's a humbling reminder. Even when you try to forget, ink remembers. The cat from yesterday slips in like a rumor and sits squarely on a rolled charter, because of course it does. You lift the animal and get the look that says, "You are staff." The parchment warms under your palm. You picture, not very helpfully, a future century where someone finds cat paw prints on a page and smiles across 800 years. Joke number 2. If there were patron saints of marginalia, the cat would petition for canonization on grounds of service. You watch the illuminator test carbon black beside iron gall in a margin. The bone black velvety, the iron gall ink shining wet, then settling to matte certainty. "See," he murmurs with his eyes because speech is rationed. This outline holds the figure, this wash fills it. You nod. The theology of craft is simple. Form and spirit. Without the form of letters, the spirit of meaning goes wandering like a sheep. Without durable ink, form dissolves and the spirit takes a nap in the moth-eaten blanket of forgetfulness. A mainstream detail with numbers lands softly. A scribe hand copying a gospel might manage a few well-formed pages a day. An entire massive Bible in a neat texturous script could occupy a team for years. That investment explains the chains and the inventory lists, the lending policies that read like treaties, and the small fines that sting as much as nettles when a book goes missing or comes back stained. In some houses, borrowers swear oaths. In others, the librarian's glare suffices. You consider alternatives again. Wax tablets for quick notes with styluses clicking like beetle legs. Potsherds in the Mediterranean world pressed into service as scratch paper. Birch bark letters up in Novgorod where winter has a backbone. All useful, all cheap, all temporary. For permanence, you need the holy trinity of the page. Good skin, good ink, and a careful hand. Remember the smell in this room? Vinegar, charred marrow, warm glue. That's the scent of permanence trying to happen. But permanence has its perils. Poorly made iron gall inks can turn corrosive, eating the page like regret, while lazy carbon inks can smudge and never quite settle. So you listen to the old brother measure by feel. The glug of gum, the color of the brew, the way a drop stretches between finger and thumb before snapping. He's using a recipe that probably never lived on parchment, a tradition transmitted by practice and a dozen quiet corrections. When it works, the pages lie flat, the lines are true, and the letters sit in the parchment as if grown there. Your third joke arrives with a grin you keep behind your teeth. Someone once tried to save time by diluting the ink, and the prior's comment, delivered with saintly calm, was essentially, "The Word of God should not look like it needs a nap." The hint was taken. The next batch could have passed for midnight in a jar. By afternoon, you're writing. The quill whispers. Each letter stands like a tiny pillar. You blow gently, no huffing, you learn that the hard way, and the page exhale dries with dusting sand. You realize ink mattered more than gold isn't metaphor, it's budget logic. Gold leaf, once applied, shows off. Ink affirms titles, transmits law, preserves music, instructs novices, and anchors the memory of donors whose generosity keeps the beans and barley flowing. A monastery can survive without glitter. It cannot function without text. You look again at the bones in a basket near the hearth. Future blackness, future lines, future sentences. In a week, some will be ash. In a month, ash will be wash. In a year, a student will trace a finger along a rubric and chant by it. The chain on the book is there the same reason you lock your door. Not because you're afraid, but because what you keep inside is life. The bell leans its weight into the room, and the sound moves over your skin like warm wool. You set down the quill. The page looks back at you, loyal and a little proud. Somewhere, the cat knocks over something that wasn't sufficiently centered in its worldview. You smile and don't fix it yet. There will be time. There is always time, as long as the ink holds.
The kitchen door creaks open, and the smell hits you before the sight does. A blend of boiled cabbage, wood smoke, and something faintly animal. You step inside and find bones stacked in a wicker basket by the hearth, pale and clattering gently as a brother tips in the day's leftovers. This is not a butcher's shop, but the scraps tell stories. Sheep knuckles from a stew, goose bones stripped clean after a feast day, even slender fish spines that glitter like tiny icicles. Nothing here goes to waste, not in a monastery where each object might have 2 or 3 lives before it's finally buried in earth. You stoop and examine the bones. They're ordinary, yet in the lamplight they glow faintly ivory, like fragments of a hymn that forgot its melody. A mainstream fact to ground you. Medieval monasteries often kept herds of sheep, pigs, or cattle, and their kitchens produced a steady stream of bone material. These bones were sometimes boiled down for broth, sometimes carved into tools, needles, combs, dice, and sometimes, as you are now discovering, dried and saved for ink production. The cook waves you off with flour-dusted hands. He knows the bones are destined for a different set of brothers, the ink makers and scribes. You can almost imagine a medieval group chat. One monk saying, "Don't toss those ribs. Brother Thomas needs them for the Psalms." Practical recycling, medieval edition. Joke number 1. Some bones are already half prepared. A younger brother rinses them in a pail, scrubbing with sand to remove bits of sinew or fat. The result is surprisingly clean, almost sterile, as though preparing them for surgery. Quirky tidbit. In some places, bones were even sun-bleached on cloister walls, letting rain and weather help with the cleaning before they were burned. It must have made for eerie decor, rows of ribs quietly drying where others prayed. You trail after the bone basket as it moves from the kitchen to a storage room near the workshop. The space feels more like a pantry for secrets than a storeroom. Herbs hanging from rafters, jars of powdered minerals, rolls of parchment. In the corner, bundles of bones are stacked by type, long femurs separate from little knuckles, jawbones in a curious pile.
You half expect a monk to label them like modern office supplies. Good for ink, good for broth, good for carving spoons. Historians still argue whether bone-black pigment was consistently produced within monasteries themselves, or if it was sometimes purchased from traveling specialists who made carbon pigments on demand. The archaeological record is thin. A few pigment residues here, some workshop notes there. What's clear, though, is that bones were a common raw material, and monasteries were nothing if not resourceful. You kneel by the stack and pick up a rib. Smooth, hollow, light, like the frame of a flute. You imagine how easily it could become something else. A whistle for shepherds, a stylus for wax tablets, or, in this case, fuel for ink that would outlast the whistle and the stylus combined. The rib might not play music, but it will carry words across centuries. One brother chuckles softly as he notices your fascination. He gestures towards a set of bone tools on his belt. A scraper fashioned from shin bone, used to thin parchment. Another reminder: parchment, bones, ink, all three parts of the same animal, converging in one book. Joke number 2. Medieval monks might have invented nose-to-tail cooking before chefs made it trendy. Except here, it's hoof to quill.
You step outside for air, and the courtyard greets you with quiet. Chickens scuttle near the barn, their feathers catching the last of the light. A monk herds a cow into the byre, the bell on its neck clanking gently. You suddenly realize every animal here has a double destiny. Its milk feeds the brothers, its hide may become parchment, and its bones might end up in an ink pot. This isn't cruelty, it's continuity. A mainstream fact returns like a steady beat. The Latin word ossa, for bones, appears often in inventories, sometimes bundled with materia scriptoria, materials for writing. Even administrative lists quietly acknowledge the bone's role in knowledge-making. Not glamorous, but essential. Back inside, the workshop's brazier is lit, and the first small bundle of bones rests above the flames. The fire snaps and hisses. A monk stirs with iron tongs, careful not to let the bones flare into open flame. They must char, not crumble. Smoke threads upward, carrying a tang you can't quite name. Part campfire, part roasted marrow, part something more ancient. You wrinkle your nose. The monk smiles faintly, as if to say, yes, holy work sometimes stinks. You glance again at the baskets, bones large and small waiting for their turn. The sight is almost comical, like waiting room patients ready to become pigment. Joke number 3. If Bones had a Yelp review for this process, it would probably be 0 stars, would not recommend, but admittedly we last 1,000 years. A quirky detail: some recipes suggest boiling bones in vinegar before burning them, to strip any lingering grease and make them ash more evenly. The vinegar tang you smelled last night makes sudden sense. It wasn't salad dressing, it was pigment prep. The flames deepen, the bones blacken, and soon they'll be ground into powder. You realize you're watching not destruction, but transformation. These scraps from dinner, destined for the midden, are instead becoming the foundation of words. In a monastery where nothing is wasted, bones move through stages of usefulness: meal, broth, tool, pigment, and finally, memory.
The bell for vespers rings faintly outside, pulling brothers toward the chapel. One monk covers the brazier carefully, leaving the bones to cool in the ashes. You linger a moment longer. The bones that once strutted as geese or clattered as cows now lie silent, waiting to be turned into a fine dust. You sense the paradox. Life reduced to ash, ash turned to ink, ink turned to words that grant life again, spiritual, eternal, recorded. As you step into the twilight cloister, the air feels sharp and clean compared to the smoke inside. You picture tomorrow's task, grinding those brittle bones into pigment. Tonight, though, they rest in the hearth's embers, transformed but unfinished, like a sentence that hasn't reached its final period.
You come back to the workshop before dawn. The brazier, only a sullen glow, and the room smells like last night's secret. Smoke braided with vinegar, and an odd sweetness that must be marrow finishing its long goodbye. The basket you watched is empty. The bones you knew have changed states the way water turns to mist. A lidded earthenware pot sits in the coals like a tortoise in warm sand. You reach toward it, palm hovering, and feel a low heat humming. A brother nods at you and taps the lid with a spoon. The sound comes back dull and close, the music of something being remade in the dark. The method is simple by design, because it has to be. You pull the pot carefully from the fire with tongs, set it on a slab, and lift the lid. A puff of breathless smoke curls out, gray and shy. Inside, where white gleam used to be, everything has gone dusky. The bones are now sooty sticks, fragile as burnt bread ends. They didn't blaze. They weren't allowed to. They smoldered without much air, starved of oxygen by the lid and the snug bed of coals. That's the secret. You're not cremating, you're carbonizing. If flames take over, you get chalky ash with nothing to write with. If heat moves slowly and the pot stays sealed, you get what the brothers want. A black rich enough to anchor vowels and outline saints' sleeves. A mainstream historical fact leans in like a patient teacher. The pigment you're making has a name, bone black, also called bone char, composed largely of calcium phosphate with a delicate web of elemental carbon threaded through it. In later centuries, painters will love it for its cool, velvety tone. Printers will swear by it, and sugar refiners, oddly, will discover it filters syrup into clarity. For now, in this monastery, it's ink's dark heart. You lift a piece with the tongs, and it threatens to crumble from its own shadow. The surface catches the lamplight with a sheen that isn't shine exactly, more like the quiet of midnight on water. The brother rubs a corner between finger and thumb. A soft streak marks his skin, as if he's been shaking hands with night. Quirky tidbit: some craftsmen judge a batch by the sound it makes under the pestle. Good bone black whispers like dry footsteps on wool, while poorly charred pieces screech like a violin played by a cat you both know from the scriptorium. You do not invite the cat to the grinding party for reasons of product quality and furniture safety. This turning of bone into black is a choreography of heat and patience. First, you dried and degreased. Remember the vinegar bath, the sand scrub, the sun bleaching along cloister walls that gave everyone the feeling the architecture had teeth? Then the covered burn,
Here, in a pot or an iron box if you're fancy, nestled in coals so heat can move inward without flames licking away the carbon you're trying to keep. Some houses with bigger budgets or good friends in a nearby forge use more specialized covered vessels. Others make do with clay and caution. Historians still argue whether most monasteries achieved a consistent painter-grade bone black in-house, or whether they sometimes bought the pigment pre-made from itinerant specialists who showed up like spice merchants with pockets full of shadow. The brother tips the pot gently, and you hear a soft rainfall of charcoal slivers. They gather in a wooden bowl, a heap of hushed thunderheads. The colors are not uniform. Some pieces go a closed plush black. Others hint at blue or smoke brown. That's normal. Variations in bone type, cow femur versus goose wing, burn a little differently. You notice a stack of smaller pots labeled with marks. Nothing so obvious as sheep or goose, but a code of slashes and circles that means something to the keeper of this corner. If you were allowed to ask, he might say he blends for consistency later. For now, he smiles like someone who knows how secrets keep the day interesting without being dramatic.
You set up the mortar, its stone bowl cool and steady, and begin to grind. The pestle lifts and falls, a slow metronome. Pressure matters. Too fierce and you chase bits across the table as if herding soot with a broom. Too gentle and you'll spend 3 vespers in miscompline. The sound settles into that whispered wool step, and your shoulders forget to be tense. The dust rises in a cautious halo, and you keep your face back because this is not a moment for enthusiastically inhaling your future manuscript. Joke number 1. If you've ever burned dinner, congratulations, you've already done the hard part. Now just eat the smell without tasting it. As the powder grows fine, you pass it through a sieve. Larger crumbs go back into the mortar, the fine falls like dim snow into a separate dish. In a corner, a shallow tray waits with a skim of water. You add a spoonful of powder and swirl. The heaviest grains settle quickly, the lightest drift and dawdle. You pour off the top, levigation, a fancy word for decant the floaters, and set that aside as the finest grade. Artists in later generations will prize this for velvety glazes. You aren't painting, not today, but the principle is the same. The smoothest words deserve the smoothest black. A mainstream note from the longer arc of craft arrives with a bookish wink. Late medieval and early Renaissance recipe books, paint shop manuals, and household collections describe making ivory black and bone black by charring in covered pots, always away from direct flame. Ivory black, produced from true ivory, yields an even smoother blue-tinted black and was a luxury pigment. It shows up in paintings and more rarely in manuscripts, with a budget that could underwrite a choir. Your monastery is not grinding tusk. The cow who walks the cloister pasture supplies everything politely. There's a comfort in that. The gospel shouldn't depend on elephants. You test a pinch of the powder between finger and thumb. It pads soft, like ash that remembers being solid. If it were gritty, you'd be back with the pestle, chasing those last hard bits into obedience. Instead, you let it fall onto a scrap of parchment lightly wetted with clean water. The droplet spreads, dries to a plush gray circle, and when you rub it, barely anything comes away. That bodes well. When it becomes ink in tomorrow's mixing, it will want to stay where you put it. In a lull, the keeper of the pots lifts the lid of a second vessel, smaller, and shows you something odd. A set of delicate comb-like bones charred so evenly they look like lace in mourning. Fish bones, he signs with his hands. Remember the monastic sign language from breakfast. And raises his eyebrows. You understand. Experimentation. Quirky tidbit number 2. We won't count, but your inner ledger smiles. Some brothers like to try alternate sources, just to see. Fish bones can make a decent black, but they're often crumbly, and the yield is miserly. Still, the test jars line up like students in a choir, each with its own shade of night. Joke number 2 saunters in, modestly tonsured. This is the medieval version of set it and forget it, except you cannot forget it because your smoke alarm is the prior's nose, and his eyebrows are very persuasive. The brothers watch the fire like it's a guest in need of warm conversation, not drama. You read the room by layering scents. The old glue simmering gently for parchment repairs, the tart ghost of vinegar from the bone washing, the mineral hush of stone, the animal vanilla of vellum. Over all of it sits the melancholic sweetness of char, not unpleasant once you accept it. You think about how smell carries memory. Somewhere, centuries ahead, someone will open a manuscript and claim to scent old leather and dust. They won't know they're also catching a whisper of that cow's rib and this morning's grind. There is care even in what you don't do. You don't stir the pot while the bones are at their most fragile. You don't lift the lid too early because oxygen will grab the carbon and turn your effort to gray-white nothing. You don't rush the cool down. Slow cooling stabilizes the structure. Some recipes advise taking the pot from coals and burying it in warm ash until the morning. Others leave it beside the hearth, where heat fades like twilight. The brothers here prefer ash. Less temptation for the curious and less risk of someone tipping it with a sleeve. Historians still argue whether specific time and heat profiles matter much with low-tech fires, or whether "don't be foolish with your flames" covers most of it. Your own experience after one long, blinking watch says, attention is the whole craft in miniature. Joke number 3 arrives precisely when your arms begin to complain. You wonder if the rule of St. Benedict had a secret chapter titled On Core Strength Through Mortars, and then decide it probably did, written very small between humility and obedience. By late morning, you have 3 grades of powder in 3 little jars, corked and labeled with discrete marks. You resist the pull to dump them into a sticky pot. That's tomorrow's game, mixing bones with gum and water until black learns to be ink. Today is about making night that will behave. The keeper tucks the jars on a shelf away from damp, away from drafts, away from cats. You clean the mortar with sand until it squeaks and then hums, and you upend it to dry. Before you leave, you take a last look into the first pot. At the bottom, a piece has kept its shape. A rib's long curve, now light as false sleep. You could crush it to powder in 3 presses, end its architecture for the sake of smoothness. Instead, you hold it a moment. It looks like a punctuation mark, some long, elegant dash. The animal that bore it grazed in weather, flicked flies with its tail, leaned into the fence when it itched. Now its rib is almost language. That's not sad. That's useful. And in a place like this, usefulness is a kind of blessing. You set the piece down. The bell for sext rounds your ears and softens your thoughts. You wipe your hands on a cloth, leaving gray echoes like thumbprints on the day. When you step back into the corridor, the cooler air tastes simple. Somewhere behind you, 3 jars of night sit waiting for their next task, sleeping lightly on the shelf, like tame thunder.
You settle at the mixing bench the way a swimmer settles at the pool edge, your hands hovering above jars that look like they contain small thunderstorms. 3 tiny vessels of bone-black powder wait like patient owls, their lids corked against the cat's curiosity and the workshop's drafts. Beside them sits a squat jar with a slanted mouth, gum Arabic, already softened in water overnight into a clear, sticky syrup the monks call mucilage. When you lift the lid, it strings between finger and thumb like slow honey, which, as it happens, is also on the table. You remember the steps from yesterday, levigation, sieving, that quiet wool-foot whisper of powder under the pestle,
and you're relieved to learn that the next part is less about muscle and more about patience. A mainstream historical fact to tuck behind your ear: medieval scribes commonly bound their carbon-based inks, lamp black or bone black, with gum arabic, a hardened sap from acacia trees that traveled into Europe by trade routes lacing Africa and the Levant to the Mediterranean. Dissolved in warm water, gum gives pigment a body that clings to parchment instead of sulking off in a smudge. You tip a spoon's worth of bone black onto a smooth stone slab. It sits there, a small, moonless night. A brother adds a few drops of wine, not enough to throw a party, just enough to wet the powder and prevent clumping. Vinegar works too. The pigments wake like flour meeting water, darkening to a glossy paste. You feel the handle of the muller in your palm, a heavy glass pebble with a flattened base. If glass is a luxury here, a rounded stone does the same job. You begin to circle, slow and steady, grinding the black into slickness. The sound is soft and satisfying, like someone sanding a violin into silence. Joke number 1 arrives wearing an apron. This is essentially a medieval smoothie, except it is emphatically not for drinking, even if the ingredients do include honey and a splash of wine. Your stomach politely opts out. Your hands keep stirring. You pull the gum jar closer. The mucilage wobbles agreeably. You trickle a thin stream into the paste, watching it go from mud to ink, still thick like cream on a cold day. Too much gum and the nib will stick and skip as if the parchment were made of tiny hedgehogs. Too little and the letters dust away when you breathe. The proportions are a dance, not a law. You test with a quill on a scrap. A slow stroke, a little curve. The line dries to a deep plush black that sits on the surface with quiet confidence. You touch it and your finger comes away clean. Better than last week when someone's overenthusiastic gum turned the page into a crust. The illuminator still won't let that brother forget it. "Nice grout," he signed, deadpan. Honey waits its turn. A tiny spoonful goes in, a humectant, you're told, keeping the ink from drying to a brittle leaf in the pot and retarding cracking on the page. Quirky tidbit: some craft books suggest a drop of egg white, glare, whipped and settled, for an extra gloss and bind, while others whisper about fish glue or isinglass shaved from sturgeon bladders. You add the honey this time, watching it disappear into black like a secret told to someone trustworthy. The scent brightens the workshop's charred undertone, and for a second, you think of breakfast. Then the vinegar taps your nose and rescues you from culinary confusion.
The cat arrives precisely when wet ink is on the testing scrap, of course, tail aloft like a pennant of misrule. Joke number 2, the workshop's warranty does not cover paw prints, and yet history does. Archaeologists have found them, and every scribe who ever lived feels seen. You strain the ink through a square of linen into a small glazed pot to catch any stubborn grains that escaped the grind. The drip is slow and contemplative. You knock the muller free of its thin coat of black and scrape the gathered paste into the pot with a bone spatula, another place where yesterday's rib finds new dignity. The lid fits tight. A wick of string wrapped around the rim will keep curious insects from staging an expedition. Historians still argue whether European houses leaned primarily on imported gum arabic or often substituted local gum from cherry and plum trees when trade hiccuped or budgets frowned. Some recipe books make bold claims. Others quietly swap ingredients like a cook using pears when apples ran out. The end goal never changes, a line that flows, dries, and stays. You set the pot by a gentle heat to marry the ingredients. Nothing fierce, just the memory of warmth.
Too hot, and the gum will turn a sulky caramelized brown. Too cool, and the components resist one another like toddlers at nap time. The brother in charge watches with that world-class monastic skill of attending without staring. He taps the side, listens for a certain dullness that means viscosity is right, then nods. You test again with a new quill. The stroke lays down like a well-behaved ribbon. You tilt the scrap and no shine remains after a moment, only matte certainty. You think about all the ways people have tried to get ink to behave through the centuries. A pinch of salt to deter mold, a clove bud floating like a tiny lifeguard in a pot when you can afford it, a tight leather cap to keep air at bay. A quirky storage trick whispers in from travelers' tales. Some scribes filled blown eggshells with ink and sealed the holes with wax, portable inkwells for long journeys. You eye a stack of goose eggs on the kitchen sill and imagine the prior's face if you requisitioned breakfast for stationery. Maybe later. A mainstream detail about tools sidles over. Before writing, scribes pounce the parchment with fine powder, chalk, ground pumice, or cuttlefish bone to lightly abrade and degrease the surface so ink grips. Yes, another bone doing paperwork. You rub a fingertip over a pounced sheet and feel the faint tooth, like a whisper of sand under skin. It's a small preparation that saves you from grand smears. The debate over ingredients turns more philosophical when the illuminator signs soot is softer. He favors lampblack for certain outlines because it can be ground finer, captured above oil lamps with a concave spoon, or even a bread slice used as a soot sponge. You nod. Bone black brings a cool depth. Lampblack sometimes offers more inky silk. Historians still argue whether carbon inks like these were preferred for drawings, while iron gall carried most of the text load, or if in some houses carbon reigned everywhere simply because it was less corrosive to quills and pages. Surviving manuscripts suggest a mix. Your own eye today likes this bone black's poise.
You decant a portion of the fresh ink into a traveling inkhorn, a small cow horn trimmed and capped with wood, and tuck it into a pocket on your belt. The rest remains in the glazed pot on the shelf, its lid sealed with a twist of waxed linen. The shelf itself feels like a tiny fortress, high, away from heat, zealously defended against spills by a lip carved into the wood. A strip of parchment hangs from a peg with notes in an economical hand. Bone, fine. Gum, 3 parts to 1. Honey, a bean. You smile at the medieval unit. Joke number 3. Someone should publish the monastic cookbook of approximate measurements, featuring classics like Enough to Please St. Jerome and A Little Less Than Last Time. Your hands remember the motions now. Wet, mull, bind, test, strain, rest. The rhythm is the same whether you're mixing bone black or making an iron gall brew to bite letters into the skin of the page. Yet the feel differs. Carbon ink is a gentle guest. It sits on top and minds its manners. Iron gall is a purposeful visitor with small teeth. It settles in. You imagine tomorrow's scriptorium choosing between them the way a singer chooses registers. Head voice or chest voice. Both music, both true. Before you leave, you touch a quill to the fresh pot one last time and draw a tiny line along the edge of a practice sheet. It dries evenly, no halos, no granular hiss under the nib. The line is, in the best sense, boring. Dependable, uninteresting, exactly what a monk needs for 80,000 more just like it. Your shoulders drop. The bench creaks a blessing. Somewhere the bell stirs itself up for terce, and the sound threads through the room like a reminder that all this mixing and measuring is simply another form of prayer. Attention poured into a vessel and then offered up in lines and letters. You cap the pot.
The cat, denied further involvement, performs an offended loaf in the doorway. The vinegar jar, the honey spoon, the muller, each goes back to its appointed place, an inventory that looks unimportant until you imagine a library without ink. The room smells faintly sweet now, and the smoke of yesterday has receded into a memory clinging to your sleeves. You rub a thumb across your fingertips, and they come away shadowed, as if you've shaken hands with the night, and the night was cordial. The ink rests. You breathe. Tomorrow, it will speak.
You push open the scriptorium door, and a long hush greets you, the kind that isn't empty, but full, the way a seashell holds the sea. Light lays itself across the room in polite rectangles where narrow windows face south, and every desk seems to hum with the same quiet intent. You feel the air, a dry coolness from stone, a faint animal warmth from parchment, and that shy sweetness of honey still clinging to the fresh ink you mixed. Lamps wait in iron brackets for later. For now, daylight does the careful work. Your desk is a slanted board with a lip to keep the page from traveling, a ridge that your wrists will come to love. The tools are small and exact. A knife with a bone handle for trimming quills and scraping mistakes, a lead plummet for drawing lines, a pumice stone, a bit of chalk for pouncing, a horn inkwell, and a tin of sand for drying. Your quills lie in a bundle, feathers neat as monks in procession, goose for everyday work, swan if you're fancy, crow if you need a firm, small hand. You pick one up and test the nib, pressing it lightly to your thumbnail. The slit opens obediently, a small mouth ready for consonants and vowels. You start with the ruling. The page is blank, only in the way a field is blank before plowing. You lay a straight edge and pull the lead down, faint gray lines whispering themselves into being. At the margins, you see little pricks, tiny holes the width of a pin, made with an owl so the lines keep faith from one side of the sheet to the other. A mainstream historical fact walks in and takes a seat. This practice of pricking and ruling is standard across medieval Europe. Open old Bibles and charters under raking light, and you can still see the ghost grid that kept text marching neatly, 2 columns, regular as breath. Without those lines, pages go downhill in a way that would make the prior adopt a tone. You sit, and the board meets your forearms. The exemplar, your model text, rests on a stand at eye level, chained to the desk like a well-behaved dog. You copy by sight, a few words at a time, eyes shuttling between source and destination. The quill dips, rises, dabs, and you begin. Textura letters, straight-backed and close, each a little fence post marching the pasture into order. Joke number 1. Medieval ergonomics come with exactly 2 features, a board and hope. The first lines are always a negotiation. The quill wants to dig, the parchment wants to shrug. You angle your wrist, soften your grip, breathe. The ink you mixed yesterday answers kindly. It sits where you put it. No feathery bleeding, no sulky shine. The scratch is a small river sound, soothing enough to lull you if you weren't busy balancing consonants. You space the words in a way that later readers will thank you for. Some scribes forget. Posterity sends a polite, exhausted wave. A quirky tidbit leans over your shoulder. When you reach a natural hole in the parchment, because skins are skins and life comes with openings, you don't panic. You steer around it. In some manuscripts, scribes stitched holes with colored thread that later illuminators turned into flowers. Others wrote right over the gap, letters bridging the little sky. The page is never perfect, it is cooperative.
The room moves without moving. You hear a faint hiss where another scribe draws a red rubrica, guiding titles that breathe the word rubrica, red earth, from a separate pot. A boy, yes, sometimes boys learn here, clever fingers still growing into patience, runs a brush lightly across a margin, testing for dust. Somewhere, someone turns a page, and the sound is a soft sail filling. The cat performs a silent inspection from the windowsill, tail like a metronome. You keep your inkwell covered because you have learned. As letters accumulate, you settle into the discipline of the hand. Carolingian minuscule from earlier centuries sits in your mind as an ancestor, clear, rounded, standardized in Charlemagne's courts to tame the chaos of scripts across regions. A mainstream fact to tuck. That standardization improved legibility so well that humanists in the Renaissance mistook it for ancient Roman writing. Their revival of it gives us the typefaces you know. Your current page, though, lives in later Gothic habits. Tight, vertical, efficient with space, the script of crowded cities and busy universities. When you lift your eyes and the room makes you drowsy, you joke to yourself that textura is the medieval version of condensed font to fit the essay on one page. You reach for the knife, not for drama, but for grace. A letter has gone a hair too heavy, a blot bulges at a serif. You tilt the blade and gently scrape, the ink lifting in a faint powder. You pounce with chalk, rub with a soft cloth, and pass your fingers over the spot. The page forgives. Joke number 2 arrives with a wink. This is Command Z, 13th century edition, with better arm workout. You punctuate with minimal flourish. Medieval texts often run on like a river, with marks to steer the reader's breath rather than halt it. You write abbreviations, strokes over letters that confess I was in a hurry, but really say this is the standard. A hairline curve indicates an omitted M or N. A little 9 shape collapses us. The economy is elegant. When you do need a capital, you leave a soft vacancy, a square of uninked potential where the illuminator will later plant a seed of color. At midday, your back sends a message. You stand, shake your hands, and look down the long room. Some desks hold single scribes. Others share a long table, leaves of a choir spread like playing cards. Historians still argue whether monastic houses typically worked in teams by dictation, one reader, many scribes, or mostly in silent visual copying, eye to eye with the exemplar. Evidence suggests both. Business-like university shops favored speed by dictation. Cloisters like this often practiced the slow fidelity of the gaze. Your ears say only this: today, no one reads aloud.
You return to your seat and see the page emerging as a small architecture. Margins measured, columns true, a ruling grid that keeps you honest. At the foot of the gathering, you'll later add a catchword, the first word of the next choir, insurance against binders shuffling leaves like distracted card players. In the upper corners, you may add choir signatures, discrete letters or numbers to shepherd the gatherings into order. Quiet logistics support quiet beauty. You approve. Ink thickens as the pot sits. You stir with a sliver of bone. You wet the nib lightly with your tongue. Yes, you do. Everyone does. And dip again. The line returns to itself. You keep a bit of bread at hand, not for eating, but for erasing greasy smudges. Fresh crumbs lift marks without biting the page. Quirky cleaning hack. Future centuries will call this a needed eraser and charge extra. You pay with crumbs and humility. Outside, a bell combs the air, sext, and lunch comes with the low grace of barley soups and a wedge of cheese. You leave your place as it is, lay a knife across the page to mark your line, and cover the inkwell. In the refectory, a reader's voice floats. You notice how the rhythm of copying follows you even as you chew, slow, measured, patient. Joke number 3, no coffee break. Your stimulant is Latin. Back in the room, lamps begin to earn their keep. Shadows pool under desks. Flame glows along the edges of letters. You adjust your posture, shift the board to catch the light, and keep your strokes deliberate. Writing by lamplight is a craft of intervals. Dip, stroke, breathe, tilt, listen. If the wick smokes, you trim it with scissors that look like a question. If the lamp sputters, you move to the window and let the last pale gold of day steady your hand. Someone sighs down the row, the kind of small, satisfied exhale that means a page is finished. You glance, envy briefly, and then fold yourself back into the line you're making. You are not hurrying, you are partnering with time. The ink dries. Sand whispers when you need it. The knife smiles in its quiet way when you don't. As twilight deepens, you close the day's work with a small colophon to yourself. Nothing elaborate, just a note in your head. Here I was, and the ink behaved. Somewhere, miles of channels away, traders lead gum Arabic along desert roads, and shepherds keep geese fat against winter. The bones you ground into darkness yesterday have become the voice of this page. It's an ordinary miracle, and you get to perform it with a feather. The bell gathers you for vespers. You cover the inkwell, slide the quill into its bundle, and place a clean sheet over the page to keep dust and cats from collaborating. The room releases you without hurry. You step into the corridor and carry with you the scratch of the quill, the gray comfort of lead lines, the faint sweetness of honeyed ink. The scriptorium quiets behind you, but the letters keep talking to the page, as if they can't help themselves. When you return after prayers, the last task is simple. You check that everything has dried to certainty. It has. You smile a little at how uninteresting the page looks. Not plain exactly, but calm, like a pond holding the sky. This is what you were after all along. Words steady enough to let the meaning be the drama. You pinch out the lamp, and its smoke draws a single line that would make any scribe proud.
You settle back at your desk and feel the margins looking at you, those wide, pale avenues that the text politely refused, the quiet space where the page breathes. You've kept them clean so far, like a freshly swept cloister walk, but the room around you is full of whispers. A soft snicker 2 tables over, the barely contained smile of the illuminator uncapping a tiny pot of red. You know what's coming. The margins are about to get interesting. You test your pen on a scrap, those little practice zigzags and alphabet ladders that scribes leave like fingerprints, and then, with the same ink that behaved so admirably for psalms, you let your wrist loosen. A small curve, a little ear, a whisker. Suddenly, there's a rabbit, upright, ears cocked like tiny sails. He looks like he's waiting for a bus that won't come for 600 years. With 2 more strokes, he's holding a spear. You add a grin you're not entirely proud of, and the page looks back at you with a conspiratorial tilt. Mainstream fact glides in, unruffled.
Medieval manuscripts, especially from the 13th and 14th centuries in England and France, teem with marginalia, the little drolleries that parade rabbits with weapons, snails in armor, foxes preaching to geese, bishops chasing bees, and musicians lodged in the mouths of fish. Open the Gorleston Psalter or the Luttrell Psalter in your mind, and the edges of devotion start to giggle. The core text stays solemn. The edges do cartwheels. You add a snail. Of course you do. It's a tiny, dignified beast, helmeted like a walnut with ambitions, facing down a knight who suddenly realizes his training never covered this. The knight's plume droops at a tragic angle. Your line is swift and sure thanks to yesterday's bone black. The shell gleams glossy where the ink pools for a breath and then dries to velvety calm. You consider a caption, Latin for slow and steady with a wink, but decide the silence is funnier. Joke number 1. In 1,000 years, someone will open this book and say, "Ah, yes, medieval memes," and you will accept the compliment from your very long nap. A boy working gesso at the far table peeks over, eyes bright. He is not allowed to laugh, so his shoulders do it for him. The illuminator raises both brows, the sign language equivalent of behave, and then, when the boy looks away, adds a discreet red tongue to your snail. Collaboration achieved. Rules mostly intact. You pretend not to have noticed, the way you pretend not to notice the cat's paw prints drawing on the charter left near the window yesterday. We are all complicit in the art of the margin. Quirky tidbit creeps in with a flourish. Scribes sometimes use the edges for practical things too. Little pointing hands called manacles that jab, "Look here." Face doodles turning into paragraph marks. Even arithmetic. One Irish scribe famously wrote a quick verse about his cat hunting mice while he hunted words. Another, colder soul, muttered in a margin, "The snow is very deep. My candle is short." You nod in solidarity across time. You'd draw a tiny blanket if the prior would allow blankets in margins.
Historians still argue whether the warrior snails and villainous rabbits are satire, moral allegory, or the scribe's therapy during a long winter of thin soup. Some say the snail mocks cowardly nobles. Others claim it's a spiritual lesson about humility defeating pride. A few suggested simply a running inside joke that spread faster than a rumor about extra feast day honey. The truth sits in your hand, which is to say it refuses to sit anywhere at all. You like the uncertainty. It leaves room for play. You glance at the text block, Psalms today, and leave the words their space. The doodles keep politely to the edges, lurkers in the periphery. You draw a rabbit turning the tables on a hunter, his arrow pointing fearfully backward. The inversion tickles you. It's the old world turned upside down, a medieval pastime as old as feast day topsy-turvy. Joke number 2 slides in on little paws. Somewhere an abbey's HR department, which is also a single exasperated prior, would file this under role reversal, acceptable in margins only. The tools don't change just because the mood does. You take out the same knife you used to lift a blot, and now you flick a feathered line into a fox's tail. The same pounce that keeps your letters crisp gives the snail an admirable grip on the page, as if he's really hauling his house uphill. For color, if you choose it, a blush of red lead under a white line makes a rabbit's ear look warm. A breath of verdigris turns a field into suggestion. You're careful with the greens. Verdigris can bite the page if overindulged, like a guest who won't leave the party. Bone black stays behaved. It outlines, shadows, defines,
then quietly sits. A mainstream scholarly detail leans against the window. Glosses, the neat scholastic notes crowding university texts, once colonized margins with just as much energy as your doodles do here. In law books and Bibles, the authoritative text nestles in the middle while commentary curls around it like ivy on a wall. The habit of thinking in the margins, literally, trained a continent to argue with itself politely with pen. Your rabbits are not glosses, but they share the instinct. The edge is where play and critique get to stretch their legs. You give your snail an opponent's shield emblazoned with a kitchen ladle because sometimes the joke is just that specific. The boy sees again and nearly inhales a gold leaf. You assume no responsibility and consider adding a musician perched on a branch, portative organ balanced on his knee. He'd need tiny bellows. You sigh happily and draw them. Because of course you do. The cat arrives and sits squarely on your blank folio, as if auditioning for sainthood in distraction. You relocate the animal with the respect due to a senior staff member, and use a crumb of bread to lift a hair from the ink. Joke number 3, the cat has notes on your composition, and they involve more fish.
You think about time. Margins are time you weren't strictly given, but took kindly. After copying 3 columns that marched like soldiers, your hand needs to remember curves. The rule doesn't forbid delight, it just doesn't schedule it. You carve it out with a feather. You sketch a vine that spills down the border and ends, inexplicably but delightfully, in a tiny man playing a bagpipe through his nose. Before you protest at your own imagination, recall that marginal life loves the grotesque specifically because it isn't bound by the sober grammar of the main text. The vine loops near a pricked hole in the parchment, and you turn the defect into a drum. 2 taps with the quill, and a drummer emerges, pleased to find a ready-made instrument like a gift from the cow who lent the skin. A brother passes, pauses a moment, and traces the air above your work with a finger, not touching, he's not suicidal, but admiring. He signs, small, leave space. You nod and do. The blank at the corner will glow with gold tomorrow, and too many jokes would crowd the light. The page needs its quiet. The point of the margin is not chaos, it's counterpoint. You sketch a manacle pointing from the rabbit to a rubric, as if the doodle is reminding you to be serious now. The humor makes the solemn richer, not thinner. Your bone-black line is consistent. Remember the patience of the pot, the careful grinding, the honey bead? All that labor is invisible here unless you know to look, and you do. So the joke lands twice, once for the viewer, once for the craft. You rest your hand and look along the bench. Another scribe has drawn a monkey in a monk's cowl, reading a book with heroic concentration. You love him instantly, and decide your rabbit is reading over his shoulder. Across the aisle, someone has tried a human-faced sun that looks like it regrets everything since dawn. You're gentle in your mind. Not every experiment succeeds. The page forgives better than people do. When the lamp wicks are trimmed and evening leans its head against the window, you dust the margin lightly. A soft sprinkle of sand, a breath, the extra lifted away. The outlines are dry, no smear, no halo. You close your hand over the knife, feel the bone handle warm from your grip, and remember the animal kinship of the page. Bone-black ink outlining jokes on skin smoothed with chalk ground from other bones. The text says, "Remember you are dust," and the margin says, "and also a little ridiculous." Both are true. Together, they are bearable. You lay a protective sheet over the work and push back the bench. The room releases a collective sigh you can't hear, but you feel, like a lake settling at sundown. The bell calls you to vespers, and as you turn, you glance once more at the snail and his knight. They're caught mid-standoff, patient as saints. The silence between them is long and friendly. You think that suits the page. In the chapel, the chant unwinds. You carry within you the day's little theater at the edge of Scripture. Rabbits bold as headlines, snails untroubled by speed, foxes who arguably should not preach. The text held its ground, the margin danced. When you return later, everything will be dry and unassuming, as if it had always been there. You smile at the thought, and your voice blends with the others, steady as ink. You catch the debate at a natural pause in the day, the kind of pause the rule doesn't schedule, but allows, after none, before the kitchen rattles for supper, when hands are free enough to waggle opinions. The workshop draws the disputants as surely as a kettle draws steam. One brother stands by the lamp and pinches his fingers together, the sign for soot. Another pats the shelf with your jars of carefully ground bone black. A third taps a bundle of dried oak galls like a teacher with good chalk. No one raises a voice, this is a monastery, but eyebrows work overtime. You take your place near the ink bench and listen with your eyes. The lampsuit brother gestures toward a concave spoon blackened to a satin sheen, lamp-black cod the old-fashioned way, held over an oil flame until the underside turned to midnight. He makes a pen in the air, dip, stroke, glide. Lampblack, he insists silently, gives the silkiest line. He is not wrong. Carbon particles that tiny make a plush, velvety black that looks like the idea of ink suddenly remembered it was visible. Across from him, the oak gall partisan draws a slow line on a test scrap and tilts it to the light. Iron gall ink darkens as air bites it, turning gray to serious black. He points to the fibers of the parchment, taps them with a bone spatula, as if to say, it lives inside the page, not on top. Mainstream fact steps forward and bows. From late antiquity through the medieval period, iron gall ink becomes Europe's document workhorse. Oak gall steeped in water or wine, mixed with iron salts, vitriol, and bound with gum. It bites enough to hold, dries quickly on pounced skin, and keeps its message when hands rub and margins brush. The bone black advocate, your ally given yesterday's grinding, lifts one of your jars and tips a pinch onto the slab. He mulls it with a drop of wine, a ribbon of gum, and draws a stroke with a spare quill. It dries cool and deep, an even black that doesn't brown in the way some iron galls do after long years. He pats the pot, then points at a margin vine curling around a rabbit you drew. Bone black excels at outlines and washes. He is not wrong either. You feel smug for exactly one breath, and then remember humility is the house specialty. Joke number 1, you briefly consider starting a medieval ratings channel. Welcome back to Inks and Thinks. Today we compare 3 ways to make your letters less disappointing, and then file the idea under things the prior will not bless. You stir a pot with a sliver of bone and bring texture into it. What it feels like when the nib drags, when a line feathers, when it resists erasure. Carbon inks sit politely on the surface. They can smudge if you swipe too soon, but a well-bound batch stays obedient. Iron gall digs in. Scrape it and it powders, but sometimes it scars because it has chewed the skin a little. You can practically hear future conservators murmuring prayers over acidic recipes that went too far. Letters literally eating their page. Quirky tidbit wrinkles its nose. Some recipes, those enthusiastically vinegar forward or spiked with too much vitriol, age into page nibblers. Other scribes add crushed eggshells or soot to tame the bite, and a clove in the pot to discourage mold, which is trying to found a monastery of its own.
A novice with purple-stained fingers edges closer, holding a little pot like contraband. He opens it to reveal a cheerful bruise of color. Berries, he signs, elderberry maybe, and walnut hull liquor in another jar. The smell is summer, caught by the spoon. He writes a line, and the page glows a friendly violet that will, wander toward brown or ghost away entirely by the time your great-great-grand students are reading. Still, it's pretty now. You smile and let him have his moment. Historians still argue whether berry-based inks played any serious role in monastic production, or were mostly schoolroom and household conveniences, attractive, local, and fleeting. Your nose says ephemeral. Your eyes say delightful. Both can be true. Not every mark is meant to hold court in eternity. Someone fetches a stick of charcoal from the hearth. A wood suit cousin called bistra when prepared from beechwood, later beloved by artists for warm washes. Another brother pantomimes cutting a sturgeon, apologies to the fish, and spreads hands to show a sack, isinglass, the fish glue that can bind ink in a pinch. And someone whispers the word sepia with a smile in the lips, if not in the throat. Cuttlefish ink, known since antiquity along coasts. A soft brown, rarely seen this far inland. The workshop, suddenly, is a little cabinet of curiosities. Joke number 2, you're one gum Arabic shipment away from opening a pop-up monk and mortar boutique specializing in seasonally sourced small batch inks. The discussion circles back to use cases. For texts meant to last, gospels, charters, cartularies, the oak gall brother taps the parchment and lifts his brows. For drawings, for underpainting, for marginal menageries that need rich shadows, the bone black brother taps your rabbit and gives you an approving glance that feels like being knighted by a jar. For quick notes, for letters home, if you're a lay clerk with a mother who worries, for school copybooks, the novice's berries raise their cheery purple fingers. You offer a pragmatic test, because this isn't theory, this is your day. You lay 3 lines side by side, one of each. You breathe on them gently. The berry line smears like a shy confession. The carbon line holds, if you give it a second. The gall says, do your worst, and looks smug. You wet a fingertip and touch each line. The carbon lifts a sigh of gray. The gall barely winks. The berry throws its hands up as art and vanishes toward faint tea. You scrape with your knife. The carbon powders away with minimal fuss. The gall leaves a thin ghost because it has settled into the skin. The berry, reduced, begs not to be judged because soon it won't exist to defend itself. The room nods. Results are sermons that don't need words. A mainstream reference bows in from a shelf older than your house. Theophilus, the 12th century author of De Diversis Artibus, wrote instructions for artists and craftsmen on pigments and media, including advice on inks and binders. Evidence that these arguments have a paper trail longer than any of you have had hair. Later, Cennini will pen counsel for painters that includes carbon blacks and iron galls. You won't read him, but his ghost seems to pull up a stool when you grind. The lampsoot brother does his last best party trick. He lights a lamp, holds a shard of bread over the flame to harvest soot, then scrapes the blackened crumb into a dish and mashes it with a drop of wine. The room watches the little culinary sacrilege and tries not to be hungry. Yes, bread is also your eraser. Yes, bread is also your soot sponge. Medieval bread is the Swiss Army knife of carbohydrates. He writes a curve so smooth you want to skate on it. You can almost hear the cat purr from the windowsill. The cat, to be fair, purrs at dust motes. Quality control is not its strength.
Then the oak gull brother points to an old charter, brownish now, but legible, firm, and taps the date. 200 years, weather, fingers, breath. The line still speaks. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't need to. The parchment's memory is his witness.
Historians still argue whether the widespread dominance of iron gall in administrative and sacred texts came from its chemistry alone or from institutional momentum. Scribes trained in it, training others, habits compounded like interest. Your hands know one answer, the archive knows another. Either way, the world learned to trust the bite. You retreat to your bench and mix a small dual batch, 1 pot of gall for today's columns, 1 pot of bone black for the border you know you'll draw when the bell gives you a breath. You add a drop of honey to both, because your last experiments taught you about cracks and crumbs. You sign to the novice to put a clove in each. Mold loves monastic humidity almost as much as the cat loves the warm spot where you keep your elbows. Joke number 3 set its elbows on the table. You assure both camps you'll be ecumenical. Iron gall for the sermon, bone black for the jokes. The lamp soot brother mimes heartbreak. You promise him an outline he'll like. Peace returns, the kind made not by conquest, but by assignment of tasks. Before the bell for Vespers, you write a tiny note at the bottom of your test sheet, your own private colophon of craft. Bone for velour, gall for law, berries for joy. The page looks back at you with faint amusement. You dust it, tuck it under a weight to dry, and move toward the door. Behind you, the lamp flame leans, soot-flecked spoon held just so. The gall pot sits like a small planet contemplating gravity. Your jars of bone black sleep with their lids on, remembering ribs and ash, tomorrow's lines already coiling in their shadow. You step into the cloister and listen to the quiet without fully leaving the debate. It will run under the day for as long as there are pages to fill. What to bind, what to burn, what to bottle, what to trust with meaning. You feel oddly rested by it. Choices sharpen attention. Attention is the point. You walk out into the cloister court the next morning, and the air carries the mingled smells of barley porridge and damp stone. You expect silence, but instead you hear 2 brothers whispering, rare given the rules. You pause just long enough to catch the phrase, "The merchants come tonight." That tells you everything. The monastery might pretend self-sufficiency, but ink recipes travel like gossip, and gossip always has a price. You follow the scent of hay and the sound of hooves to the outer gatehouse later that day. A donkey cart rattles in, and on its back, bolts of cloth, sacks of salt, bundles of quills, and a little chest bound with iron straps. The merchant bows low at the porter's glance. Inside that chest are things rarer than jewels here. Tiny lumps of gum arabic, cakes of verdigris, maybe a vial of red cinnabar if you're lucky, and most secret of all, a folded scrap of parchment with a recipe scrawled in shorthand. A mainstream historical fact threads itself through this scene. Monastic communities were nodes in larger trade webs, receiving gum from the Levant, vitriol from mines in Saxony, and pigments carried across Italian and French fairs. Recipes themselves were guarded closely. Some circulated in craft manuals. Many passed mouth to ear only, wrapped in oaths of silence. A single phrase could be the difference between ink that lasted a century and ink that flaked off in a season. The cellarer inspects the chest, sniffs a lump of gum, and weighs it in his palm like a jeweler. He nods and pays in coin and grain. The merchant glances toward the scriptorium and then looks away. He knows better to pry. You imagine him back at the fair boasting, "This recipe straight from a Cistercian house, tested on psalms." Joke number 1. In medieval marketing, influencers wear cowls and write in Gothic script. Inside, the recipe sheet is unrolled on the workbench. It's written in an odd shorthand, alchemical squiggles, half Latin, half symbols, all designed to look like gibberish unless you're already in the circle. One sign means oak gall extract, another stands for honey to taste. You smile. Secrecy loves drama. Historians still argue whether these coded instructions were genuine protections of trade secrets or simply a way of making a craft look more arcane to outsiders. Either way, it works. You join the Keeper of Inks as he copies the recipe into the monastery's private notebook, a book chained in the armarium, read only by those trusted with pigment. He writes in tiny minuscule, margin notes in red, tested, held well. You realize you're watching the medieval version of a lab log, equal parts cookbook and spellbook. Quirky tidbit. In some houses, monks deliberately swapped recipes with friendly abbeys by embedding them inside devotional letters. Send prayers, and here is how we thicken our ink with gum from Syria. The letters looked pious, but carried practical treasure, a holy version of file sharing. You imagine a prior raising his brow and murmuring, "Brother, that was not quite what I meant by spiritual nourishment."
The jars on your shelf remind you of a truth the merchant knows well. Ingredients may travel, but proportions stay hidden. You can buy gum in a sack, but how much gum to use with how much bone black? That's the Brotherhood's inheritance. It's why abbeys defend their notes as fiercely as relics. After all, if your rival monastery's ink fades and yours endures, whose charter looks like God's handwriting? Later, as twilight bruises the sky, you watch the merchant leave with his donkey cart. He glances back once, eyes on the high walls, no doubt thinking of the secrets sealed behind them. Joke number 2, the monastery may vow poverty, but with its recipe book chained in the library, it's basically running intellectual property law 800 years before the patent office. Trade isn't only with merchants. Pilgrims bring knowledge too. Whispers of what Greeks did, or how Arabs refined soot, or how Jews in Iberia used pomegranate rind for dyes. Some of these rumors are true, some are the medieval equivalent of urban legends. A pilgrim swears an Egyptian scribe used crocodile dung for ink. The brothers exchange skeptical glances, but note it down anyway. Historians still argue how much craft knowledge traveled by books versus by foot traffic. How often a casual conversation at a fair gave birth to a new recipe at a cloister hearth. In the evening, the prior himself inspects the ink pots. He dips a quill, draws a cross on a scrap, and holds it to the lamp. His nod is slight but approving. This isn't just curiosity, it's governance. The monastery depends on charters, on letters sealed with wax, on books copied with dignity. If ink fails, the monastery falters. The recipe book is as vital as the rule itself. You imagine the hidden economy swirling beyond these walls. Scribes in Paris haggling for gall ink strong enough for student notes. Venetian traders boasting of lamp black finer than any soot. A Benedictine in Burgundy swearing his bone black makes the darkest psalms. Joke number 3. If there had been a medieval trade show, you picture booths labeled, "Now with 20% more tannins," and monks handing out free quill sharpeners. The night settles. You step into the cloister walk, hearing the fountain drip. Somewhere on a shelf, the secret recipe rests, written in tight script, locked and guarded not by dragons, but by discipline. Tomorrow, you'll use it as if it were ordinary, dipping quills, scratching letters, drying sand. But tonight, you feel the weight of secrecy and trust. Recipes travel, ink travels, words travel. What does not travel, at least not freely, is the know-how, the gestures of the hand,
the feel of viscosity, the sound of powder under a muller. That the monks keep close. You breathe deep. The scent of gum, smoke, and honey hangs in your sleeve. You know what it costs to bring them here, and you know that even now, somewhere else, another brother is stirring another pot, convinced his way is better. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it isn't. Either way, words tomorrow will darken their pages and yours alike, and both will whisper into the future.
You open the workshop door, and your nose writes the inventory before your eyes do. First comes the shy sweetness of beeswax, soft and round, the kind of smell that wears a halo. It rises from candles gone tear-shaped in their iron cups, the wax pooling like little gold ponds along the rims. Then a sharper thread steps forward, vinegar, clean and insistent, as if the room keeps a jar of scolding on a shelf. Beneath both, a darker note, charred marrow, the memory of bones turning into night. You breathe in and think, yes, this is the smell of sentences forming. You follow the scents like stepping stones. To the left, a small pot of hide glue quivers at a bare simmer, translucent brown with a skin that reforms every time a patient finger lifts it. When the lid tips, a warm animal sweetness drifts up, not unpleasant if you don't interrogate it. Mainstream historical fact arriving in your nostrils. Medieval workshops used collagen glues boiled from skin, hooves, and bones for everything from parchment repairs and mounting to panel painting and gilding. Fish glue, brighter, a little briny, does similar duty when a gentler bond is wise. The monk watching the pot stirs with a bone spatula, and you imagine how the animal keeps signing its name everywhere. Page, pigment, paste, without ever asking for credit. You step past the glue, and a new smell lifts its hand. Iron gall ink steeping like tea, which is essentially what it is. Oak galls brewing their tannins into water or wine, waiting for the pulse of vitriol to turn it serious. It smells faintly of crushed leaves with a metallic afterthought, the way wet iron smells when rain has just introduced itself to a gate. You feel the tang almost on your tongue. It doesn't punch, it suggests, and you translate suggestion into caution, don't spill that. You pull the pot toward the cooler side of the bench, and it answers with a tiny resin sigh. The vinegar grows louder near the shelf where yesterday's bones have been rinsed and set to dry. Some were bathed in it before their slow burn to take the gloss of grease away and help them char evenly. The scent lingers in the wood like a reprimand that became a habit. You remember last week's experiment with verdigrease, vinegar coaxing green from copper plates, leaving a sour sparkle in the air while the metal bloomed with a powder you later bound with oil for an illuminator's leaf. The smell of green, you think, surprised that color can smell like pickles and coins. On the window ledge, a saucer of cloves throws a sweet prickle, a little apothecary's wink amid the glue and smoke. Someone has tucked a clove into each inkwell to chase mold away, and when you lift a lid, the perfume rides the black in a modest chariot. Quirky tidbit. When money and mood were generous, scribes sometimes tempered inks with rosewater or scattered lavender in the armarium to discourage insects. The good scent was practical luxury, like cushions for pages. You lift a sprig of rosemary drying from a beam, and palm its needles to release sharpness. For a moment, the workshop smells like a hillside pretending it doesn't know winter. Your eyes find the lamp corner. The smell there is a different register entirely. Lamp oil, singed and sooty, the breath of flames that have licked a spoon dark to harvest lamp black. It's faint now because the lamp is asleep, but the wick remembers with a scorched little cherry at its tip. You picture the soot-flecked spoon hovering, smoke adding exclamation points to the air. And joke number 1 wanders in. If you bottled this as a scented candle, it would be called Monastic Workshop, Notes of Boiled Hoof, Charred Rib, and Subtle Piety, and you would sell exactly 3 to very supportive friends. You edge closer to the brazier where the bone pots did their work last night. Even cold, the coals broadcast a ghost of char. A brother taps a clay lid, and the pot answers with the hollow thud of finished business. When he lifts it, a final hush of smoke escapes, a scent like black bread's crust without the comfort of butter. You think of those 3 jars of bone black sleeping on the shelf, and how smell is the echo of their making, even after the sound is gone. A little further on, the parchment table spreads a different perfume. Clean, a touch limey from distant vats where skins were dehaired. That work is done outside, thank every saint with a nose. Now warmed by hand-rubbing and pouncing. The page under your fingers smells almost edible, that animal vanilla warmth you love. When you rub pumice across the surface, a mineral rasp joins the chorus, and a tiny fog of chalk adds a dry sweetness, as if someone baked scones with dust. Candles change the room's accent depending on who lit them. In the church, beeswax glows without biting your nose, a mellow honey breath that honors the altar. In here, thrift sometimes allows tallow, and you can tell immediately, fatty, smoky, a smell like a camp kitchen that lost its manners. The prior prefers beeswax in any room where books live. You silently applaud. Historians still argue whether specific rules restricted tallow in scriptoria, or if the preference was custom, not canon, and whether poorer houses simply endured the stink for the sake of light. Your nose votes for abundance. You lift the lid on the gum jar. It smells like almost nothing, just a hint of sweetness if you imagine hard. Acacia sap is modest like that. Its quietness in the bouquet reminds you that binders make their point by not being the point. You tilt the jar and the mucilage leans, thinking about falling. It doesn't. Good gum is a well-behaved yes. On a high shelf sits a small bottle, strong wine turned to vinegar and then reduced with a pinch of saffron to make a touch of scented wash. The illuminator keeps it for blushing cheeks and rose petals, and when he uncorks it, a dreamy kitchen sneaks into the room. You wish briefly for pastry. Joke number 2 yawns, monastic eating rules would happily share this bouquet with your stomach at exactly 0 more meals. In the corner, a new odor challenges you, bright and nose-needling, ammonia, faint but real. Someone has used stale urine to degrease a stubborn patch of parchment or clean a glaze pot. The ancients knew its bite, and the habit persisted anywhere barrels were cheap and delicacy was expensive. You hold your breath politely and pivot to the herb rack again. Sage, thyme, little bundles of mint drying like quiet company. The snuggest smell belongs to warmed wood. The bench under your hands has drunk centuries of glues and inks. When the brazier burns, the wood gives them back a little at a time.
Lay your cheek down, and it's as if you're listening to a long story. You tell yourself you're only testing for dust. You are also finding an excuse to rest your eyes.
A monk, one with the best eyebrows for silent commentary, passes behind you carrying a lidded pot of gesso, the chalk and glue ground for gilding. It breathes a plastery whisper with a sweet bone note beneath. He sets it down, looks at the room, and you both smile in the knowledge that smell is your invisible calendar. If you've got vinegar and verdigris, it's a green day. If glue rules the air, repairs are in session. If cloves ride the ink, mold tried and failed to form a monastery of its own. Historians still argue whether scriptoria were enclosed specialized rooms in most houses, or if copying tasks bled into multi-purpose workspaces where glue, pigment, and parchment shared a single map of scent. The floor plans that survive never quite agree. Your nose says overlap was the rule. You think of church, a few doors away, where frankincense and myrrh rinse the air during feast days. The contrast is almost comic. Holy smoke there, homely smoke here. Joke number 3 pads in on cat paws. Your modern smoke alarm would file for a transfer and request a vow of silence. Some smells arrive only when something goes wrong. A burnt note, glue gone too hot, gum caramelized into sulk, and every head lifts. The keeper of pots moves like a man rescuing a child from a puddle, and a crisis is averted with one swoop off the coals. A sour spike means a gall ink turned vinegary. A sniff of metal too sharp means vitriol snarled the proportions. Your nose learns to be the first line of defense. You trust it the way you trust a straight edge. It keeps you honest. You pause, close your eyes, and assemble the whole place in smell alone. Beeswax halo, vinegar spine, char marrow shadow, parchment warmth, glue comfort, soot punctuation, herb flutter, clove insistence. Somewhere a draft slides under the door, and the room's bouquet reorganizes itself with the entrance of fresh air. You smile without opening your eyes. The breeze tastes of wet stone and hens. You were right. Barley porridge and damp morning were the prelude to today's chapter. When you finally look again, you realize the scents aren't just background. They are the craft's grammar. Vinegar tells you when bones are ready. Glue tells you when the page mends. Smoke tells you when carbon is born. Beeswax tells you when reverence has entered. Cloves tell you the monastery has learned from last winter's furry ink pots. If you had to teach someone how to make a book with their eyes closed, you might start with their nose. And you walk back to the bench, take up the quill, and write a line with the bone-black ink that smells only faintly of honey now that it is doing its job. The words dry, and you dust the page with a pinch of sand that smells like nothing at all. Useful silence in a noisy choir. Outside, the bell turns the air. Inside, the room's perfume settles into certainty. It will cling to your sleeve and your hair and your memory. And one day, when a future reader opens this book and sighs, "Ah, old book smell," you'll know that what they mean is bees, bones, vinegar, glue, smoke, herbs, and patience. You're midway through a page of Psalms when it happens. Your quill scratches too eagerly, the nib takes on a little too much ink, and a fat black droplet forms like a smug beetle at the bottom of a letter. You tilt the page, praying gravity will save you. Gravity, alas, sides with chaos. The blot spreads, settling in with all the stubbornness of a monk on his favorite bench. You mutter with your eyes only. Mistakes are the secret heartbeat of the scriptorium. You'd think copying holy text was solemn perfection, but the reality is a comedy of slips. Mainstream fact: medieval manuscripts are full of corrections.